Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site, bettingangle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Let's talk about the rematch. Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank. Folks, there's a saying that I believe: Father Time is unbeaten. Right? The tip-off for this fight were the health problems Chris Eubank had at the end of the first fight. Right? Just understand, Chris Eubank, great fighter. Today, as I make this video, he has a higher knockout percentage than Conor Benn, right? But you kind of saw this coming. He suffered from dehydration. Understand, his father was an excellent fighter. If you look at his father's body, you notice that Chris Eubank Sr. had a lot of muscle. He had to cut weight to make weight. So I thought it was interesting. I know at a certain age we all look at our fathers and we think, Dad doesn't understand. Well, let's just say, as a dad, I can say, we understand more than you think. I thought it was striking that Dad thought that Junior was making a mistake by fighting Conor Benn at 160 pounds. He knows his child. He's been in the game. He's been in the ring. He knows what it takes to cut weight. He looked at his kid and he realized his kid would have to cut weight to fight Conor Benn. Junior is blessed enough to out-technical Conor Benn the first fight, but his body clearly was telling him, hey, we're not going to do this again. And Junior decided to go forward with the rematch. So let me just say, in my opinion, and I believe I'm more bullish on Chris Eubank than most of the public, but in my opinion, Eubank is no longer viable at 160 pounds. Folks, he got dominated here. He faded badly in the second half of the fight. He ends up hitting the canvas, and that's significant. Because understand, Eubank hadn't hit the canvas before the Liam Smith fight. In other words, Eubank has fought many very tough opponents and is unfamiliar with hitting the canvas, but yet here he ends up hitting the canvas late in the fight. Right? He's on the wrong side of 35. Folks, Chris Eubank's 36 years old. He could go up to 168 pounds. I have seen a fighter look out of it in the closing fights, ironically, at 160 pounds. If you remember the end of Bernard Hopkins' career, then Hopkins decided, I believe as an homage to Ray Robinson, to jump to light heavyweight for a fight. He had an opportunity to fight Antonio Tarver. And you saw that fight, and it was shocking. Right? Hopkins comes in, he has all this extra energy. He's dancing around the ring. Antonio Tarver was the fighter who looked like his feet were in cement blocks. And understand, Antonio Tarver had beaten Roy Jones. Right? And he looked completely unable to deal with a rejuvenated Bernard Hopkins. It's possible that Chris Eubank can rehydrate to 168, or like Bernard Hopkins. Let's remember, Hopkins doesn't go to 168, he goes to 175. Maybe if Eubank jumps to 175, he'll have more pep in his step. The problem is the level of opposition at both stops. If he goes up to 168, the name in the UK at that weight is Hamza Shiraz. Right? You might recall Shiraz blew out Berlanga, right, in New York City. Folks, that's a tall order. Shiraz is underrated. Right? Shiraz, as it is, has one of the best jabs in the game. The Conor Benn fight was really an athlete against a technician. A Eubank versus Shiraz fight would be technician against technician. Right? Shiraz is inverted. His dominant hand is actually his left. Let's just say Eubank would have a lot to think about. If he goes to 175, oh my goodness, is that division packed? Right? Who exactly would he be able to fight? He's a technician. You have other highly technical guys at 175, right? Think Dimitri Bivol. If there's an upset in the Benavides versus Anthony Yarde fight, if Eubank were to go to 175, understand Yarde's already lost in the past. A loss he's avenged twice to Lyndon Arthur. Right? Yarde's also lost to Kovalev in a fight in which he was outboxed. Right? Eubank is a blessed boxer. If Eubank goes to 175, there's a chance he could outbox Anthony Yarde, but that's if his body is like Bernard Hopkins' body. In other words, he was weight deprived here, that's clear. If he puts on 15 pounds, right, he'd have to carry the weight well. The weight would have to rejuvenate him. Unfortunately, you and I know that that's not always the way the plane lands. Some guys gain 15 pounds and look slower, look like they're carrying luggage around in the ring, aren't ready. The problem is, against Anthony Yarde, your operating margin is thin because Yarde is one of the sport's blessed punchers in both hands. Right? If Eubank shows up and he's fighting a puncher the level of Yarde, 15 pounds higher than where he's been since 2019, Eubank could be in big trouble. Right? So if I'm Eubank at 36, your generation has already left the club. Right? You're living a different life. Boxing is a dangerous sport. We've seen countless great fighters later in life have slurred speech. Right? Later in life, be diagnosed with things like Parkinson's, which you kind of sense are somewhat related to their profession. Right? If I'm Eubank and I have my health, I would seriously think about calling it a day. It's my understanding that Eubank has a lot of money in the bank. Eubank certainly got fat checks for both Conor Benn fights. Right? If I'm Eubank, I don't try to make a play for a third fight. Why would you? Right? 1-1, that's okay. You're not on the losing end. Right? So I personally doubt Bivol ever fights Beterbiev in a third fight. Right? If I'm Conor Benn, why do I want to fight Eubank in a third fight? Keep in mind, too, 160 wasn't even Conor Benn's weight class before the first fight. Let's talk about Conor Benn. Folks, he has options. Right? He has a meaningful fan base in the United Kingdom. There's a champion at 160 who has a certain cachet with British boxing fans. Carlos Adames. Because many in the British press believe that Adames beat Hamza Shiraz, who I believe most Brits understand is one of the best fighters in the country. right? So let's just say there's a familiarity with Carlos Adames. There's that view that as good as Adonis is, he's even better than that because he may have gotten robbed in the Hamza Shiraz fight. I've talked about that fight here online. I personally thought Shiraz won the fight. There is a difference of opinion, but at a certain point, you have to look around the room and realize, wow, the group that feels the other guy won, there has to be at least 45% of this room with that view. If Conor Benn were to fight Adames in the United Kingdom, folks, that's a blockbuster blowout. Right? Understand, Conor Benn right now is viewed as a guy who kept at it. In other words, he lost the first fight. He fought courageously. Even Conor Benn critics will give him that. He comes back the second fight. He's even better. He dominates the second fight. He validates his journey. So now whatever Conor Benn does has a certain legitimacy. It has a certain authenticity. Right? Conor Benn fighting for the title, folks. That's a big payday for the champ and for him. If you're Carlos Adames, you're thinking, wow, I can get a big payday without fighting Janabek, without fighting Lara. Right? If the phone has been ringing and it's Terence Crawford, the rumor is that Crawford wants to try to annex the undisputed crown at 160. If I'm Carlos Adames, and don't get me wrong, fighting Crawford is a huge payday. Right? But I might think to myself, you know what? I can beat Conor Benn. Right? Crawford, I'm not so sure. But I could beat Conor Benn. Not only that, I might have the negotiating leverage to put a rematch clause in the contract. Right? I don't have that leverage with Terence Crawford. Right? So let's just say, Conor Benn has options. Let me also say this too. I think Conor Benn would love the opportunity to fight Terence Crawford at 160. That fight actually has a storyline that a skilled promoter could exploit. Right? Understand, Conor Benn just beat a Brian McIntyre, otherwise known as Bomac, fighter. You could have, a promotion where Conor Benn is basically saying, look, I've heard so much about Terence Crawford. I've heard so much about his trainer, Bomac. I've already been there, done that with a Bomac fighter who was supposed to be much more brilliant than me in the ring. I beat him. I knocked him down late in the fight. He got up, but let's say by then everyone knew the result was a foregone conclusion. Right? So Conor Benn could talk a lot of smack. If I'm Terence Crawford, folks, this is a great era of British boxing. It's a spectacular era. You have several divisions where you have British boxers at the forefront. Right? British boxing fights are drawing crowds that right now are not being drawn in places like the United States. If I'm Terence Crawford and I'm thinking of extending my brand, why wouldn't I take the opportunity to go to the United Kingdom? He's already crossed the Atlantic, folks. He fought Ricky Burns there, but then he was unknown. Now Terence Crawford is known. He could cross the Atlantic. Lord knows you have other fights you can put on the card to make it a Wembley event. Right? Crawford, Conor Benn on a card with Dubois against Philippe Ergovic or something like that. Folks, those fights would belong in Wembley, wouldn't they? Right? If I'm Conor Benn, 29 years old, I'm also thinking, look, I just saw Crawford against the Canelo who Canelo's a better fighter than Conor Benn. I'm not here to say otherwise. But Conor has better legs at this point of his career than Canelo. Right? If I'm Conor Benn, I'm thinking, how old is Crawford? 38 or so? Double check me on that. Right? If I'm Conor Benn, I'm thinking, you know what? I am arguably the better athlete. Right? Is there a chance that in an ambush style, because you don't want to stay in the pocket with a technician like Crawford, with an ambush style where I'm moving around the ring, is there a chance that I could catch him, drop him, have the crowd behind me, bank a few more rounds to, at a minimum, make whatever decision is reached a, disputed one that would raise my profile? Understand, Crawford's profile is so high that if you just fight a good fight against Crawford, you're raising your own profile. Understand, too, there's an interesting dynamic to that fight. Conor Benn would privately know that Terence Crawford hasn't knocked down anyone above 147 pounds. Let's just say that fight would have certain angles. So Conor Benn right now is in big play at 160. Let me go further. 154 is loaded, but there is no way, none, that Vergil Ortiz is going to be able to stay at 154 past one or two more fights. There's no way that a 6'5", 6'6" guy, Sebastian Fundora, is going to be able to stay at 154. Right? I would argue there is no way that Xander Zayas is going to stay at 154. If I'm Conor Benn, and Conor Benn's fought most of his life below 160, if I'm Conor Benn, why wouldn't I want to set up shop right now at 160? Right? He just won a fight at 160. Knowing that in a year, guys at 154 are going to start appearing in the division. Right? Just look at the ages. Just look at the weights of the guys. Right? You look at the body of Vergil Ortiz in his last fight. He looked heavier than he did at the weigh-in. This is not Manny Pacquiao. This is not Floyd Mayweather. This is not Bernard Hopkins in his heyday at 160, where you know the guy's going to make weight. The guy might even be a pound or two below weight, right? And be comfortable with it, not like Eubank was here. So, you're dealing with the opposite. You're dealing with guys at 160 where you see them at the weigh-in, the guy looks a certain way. Then you see him on fight night and you're thinking, well, I thought Vergil Ortiz was in this fight. Then you realize you're looking at Vergil Ortiz. Right, folks? Conor Benn, if he stays at 160, if he plays his cards right, you have big fights ahead of him, and understand he's the portal for the division to the British boxing public. I'm not here saying Conor Benn's as good as Eubank, right? I'm not here saying that. I'm not saying Conor Benn is as good as Terence Crawford, right? I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is, folks, the UK is where it's happening in boxing in 2025, right? Just contrast, Dubois against Usyk, the crowd, the atmosphere, to everything else. Let's just say Dubois against Usyk is competitive with everything else. Right? The crowd's there. They know boxing. They're screaming. People are excited. The event makes itself. before the fighters touch gloves for the first round. People are hyped. The announcers are hyped. Uh, British boxing has been with us long enough so that you have all these British boxing dignitaries everybody knows at the fight. That's the scene. That's where it's happening. The ambassador to all of that at 160 right now is now Conor Benn. Let's all pay attention to it. If I'm Conor Benn, the last thing I want to do is to lose weight and get in at 154. Folks, they're dangerous people there. Right? Tim Tszyu is looking for an opponent. I continue to rate Keith Thurman higher than the public. Right? Murtazaliev, folks, he's tough. Right? He might be unbeatable at the position, in the division. Right? I have Jaron Ennis on my short list of the best in the sport. If I'm Conor Benn, hey, I've tried on 160. It fits. Right? The first fight excited the crowd. They wanted a second fight. I won the second fight. I even knocked down the other guy late. I'm the man in the room in the United Kingdom at 160 pounds. Right? I don't have to be the best. Guys understand that I represent a payday. I represent brand extension. I represent an experience. That's how I see it. Let me hear from you in the comments section of this YouTube video. Should Chris Eubank continue boxing? He's 36. He has his health. He's had a health scare in the sport. Bit of a salty personality. Let's just say he's had some battles with promoters in the past. Some of the biggest promoters in the sport. Does he stick around? Does he tempt fate? Say, hey, I'm going to jump to 168. I was successful there. Let me swim in the pool before I hop in the water with Hamza Shiraz. Or, hey, I'm looking at 175. I don't think Buatsi does what I do. There's several guys in their 30s at 175. Isn't Peterbiev older than I am? Right? Lord knows there'd be paydays. But, of course, it could end badly. Right? It could be a Marciano Lewis situation. I look forward to your comments in the comment section of this YouTube video. Let me close by saying, folks, in these times that many feel are going to be hyperinflationary, consider Rolex as an inflation hedge. I'll tag some offerings that are available for purchase. Thanks for stopping by.